Zealand is also, I think there's a pause. 1 second. We got it. That's fine. New Zealand's the only country that I know of that has its own national wizard. He just retired. This dude is the national wizard of Singapore, of New Zealand, excuse me. And he was this fired professor who landed on the streets of New Zealand, and he was basically lecturing on everything from rugby to religion and stirring up, sort of discussions in city streets. And instead of kind of punishing him, the Prime Minister of New Zealand asked him to become the wizard. And his charge was to entertain the country. And that's what he did. He would hatch himself from large eggs on library roofs and other types of things. You see also differences in latitude constraint all around the world. In Germany, many of you have seen this, where people might be waiting patiently on street corners, even if there's no cars around. In my home city of New York City, you see something more like this, like people jaywalking, even with kids in tow. This is an interesting device. This is called Street Pong. They've been piloting it in some German cities before COVID. And this is an extra incentive to stay on the streets. This dude is playing an electric game of ping pong with a person across the street. And I've seen this technology. It actually shows you when the light's about to change. And so it helps you to kind of feel motivated to stay, but then know when you're supposed to leave. One more example of this before I get into some data. This is another example of just the same situation having very different amounts of constraint or latitude. This is the Tokyo Metro. All the kinds of things that you can't do on the Metro. How many people have been on the Tokyo Metro? It's a beautiful human feat, basically, of coordination. And, you can't, basically put makeup on, don't slouch, don't listen to music too loudly. I don't know what this dude is doing over here, but don't do stupid things on the Metro. And in New York City, you see something like this. Basically, there's not many rules, just behave yourself, don't do something really stupid. And these examples and many more all illustrate something really important. And Christina really said this earlier, is that all human groups have social norms, these unwritten rules for human behavior that sometimes get more formalized in terms of laws and codes. And they're really important for coordination and predictability. In many ways, social norms are our greatest human accomplishment. You can imagine a world without social norms, where people are driving on either side of the street, where people are stealing each other's food in restaurants. I've tried that in Germany, just go and ask someone, can I have a French fry? You don't get a lot of good feedback from that. Or imagine a scenario where people are having sex everywhere, like in libraries here at Penn or on the bus. That would be really kind of uncomfortable. And there's a reason why we don't do these things, because we've developed social norms to help regulate behavior and coordinate and predict each other's behavior. So really, they're the glue that binds us together, social norms. And what I've been studying over the last some years is really how strong or weak that glue is and the implications that has for a variety of different social and collective phenomena. And I refer to this as the difference between tight and loose cultures. This is a term that I inherited from Pietro Pelto, anthropologist who started writing about this in the late 60s. Tight cultures have strong norms and punishments that are reliable, that restrict the range of behavior that's permissible. And loose cultures have much weaker norms that are much more permissive, where there's a wider range of behavior that's permissible. And this is actually a construct that I mentioned. Pietro Pelto started studying this in the late 60s. It was actually an accident. He was an anthropologist studying snowmobiles and its impact on social structure in the Scott Lapse. And he's discovered something a little more interesting, which was that it was really a loose place. And he was trying to understand why the Scott Lapse is so loose, where there's such a wide range of behavior that's permissible. So I started thinking about this construct in grad school. I actually wrote a paper on this in one of Harry's classes. I found it really fascinating. It's not a new construct. It actually goes way back to Herodotus, another Greek, who started writing about this construct in the Histories, probably the first cross-cultural psych text, where he started talking about the tightness, he didn't use this term, but the restricted range of behavior that he saw in Egypt versus in Persia, where he saw much more latitude. So I'm going to talk to you about what we know about this construct now, based on work we've done in our lab and also around the world. And the questions I've been asking are as follows. First of all, do nations, as in general, differ on the strength of norms? Even though all nations have tight and loose elements, why might some cultures veer tight and some cultures veer loose? What explains such variation? What are the ecological, historical foundations of those differences? And what are the trade-offs that these differences confer to human groups? I wanted to go back also to look in the historical record to see if we can replicate some of these findings in modern nations in pre-industrial societies. So sort of take off where Pelto left off by really doing more rigorous coding of some ethnographies that we'll talk about. And I want to start thinking about this as a fractal pattern. This is a term that comes from physics, basically a repeated pattern, recurring pattern across different levels of analysis that has some degree of homology. Is there some sense that we could see similar patterns within nations, within organizations, even within our own households? I'll talk to you a little about neurobiological foundations of the strength of norms. How have these things become ingrained? And then I'm going to get into which is better and how we can use this construct to think about cultural evolutionary mismatches. This is, of course, something that happened during COVID, when suddenly we have a collective threat and we're all trying to figure out, how do we get people to behave themselves during this time? And I'm going to talk to you a little about this notion of mismatches that comes from evolutionary biology, where traits that are really great in some contexts become really problematic when the environment suddenly shifts. So we're going to talk a little bit about two different types of mismatches. And that's what we're going to do today. I'm on California time, so I'm talking a little slower than usual. Yeah. Yeah, so anyway, so let me just start from the very beginning of where we started at. This is the most macro level of analysis that we want to investigate. And this is a study that was done across many different countries and geographies and participants. And as we're asking people around the world about descriptive norms, empirical expectations around how much do people need to follow rules? How strongly are rules and norms punished in this context? How much do people conform to norms in this country context? We're also asking people about the restricted range of variation in everyday settings, like this kind of setting. I'm going to ask you, do you think this is a tight or loose situation? This is pretty tight, right? If I start singing and dancing, breaking out some bourbon, it's California time, probably won't do that, or getting on the phone to talk to my daughter, she'd be like, Christina's got to be more selective in who she chooses for this conference. So we're really here in a very restricted range of behavior setting where we are all kind of co-oriented to the same shared reality, and we are really holding that in place. When we go out to dinner tonight, that will be a much weaker situation. And in this study, in the science paper, we asked people about how appropriate are 15 behaviors across 15 situations in everyday life, like lectures, classrooms, buses, banks, your own bedroom, a public park, and so forth, to see whether or not we find similar findings with those measures as we did with the direct measures of norm strength. As we were also gathering this data, we're also getting data on the histories of these countries, their ecologies, and so also sending out RAs around the world to do some silly things that I'll tell you about in a few minutes. Well, I'm just big picture gist is that we looked at how much do people share perceptions about situations in terms of RWG values, how much do they share perceptions on general norm strength. And we found really nice examples of the fact that these are not individual perceptions. People share perceptions about how strong or weak the situations and norms are in their context, cultural context. We also showed that this construct of tight loose is different than GDP. You can have tight cultures that are rich or poor, loose cultures that are rich or poor. And it's different than other dimensions of culture, like individualism. So for example, in our data, cultures that veered tight were Singapore, Japan, China, Austria, and parts of Germany. Cultures that veered looser included places like Brazil, Greece, the US, and the Netherlands. And so in our cultural typology, you can have cultures that are individualistic and tight, like Austria and Germany, and also individualistic and loose, which included the US, New Zealand, Australia. You can also have collectivistic cultures that were quite tight, like Japan and China, but also collectivistic cultures that are quite loose. In our data, that included Brazil, Spain, and many other Latin American countries. So the question here is, what are the trade-offs? What other things does this construct correlate with, and why might it have evolved in the first place? So I'm just going to give you a really big picture about this. So what we found across the board, and this is really across levels of analysis, is a consistent order versus openness trade-off that comes along with tight and loose. So what do I mean by order? So for example, we found that there was lower crime in tight cultures in general, controlling for lots of factors. And there was much more monitoring, more police per capita. In our RA study, we found that with more security cameras in countries that veered tighter. We also found that there was more synchrony in tighter cultures. There was more likely the case that people be wearing more similar clothing. We also looked at even things like clocks on city streets. How aligned are the clocks in city streets? And it sounds like a really strange measure, but people in psychology have measured these kinds of things going around the city streets. And we know in some contexts, which turned out to be tighter contexts like Japan and Austria, the clocks were off by milliseconds. In countries like Greece and Brazil, you weren't totally sure what time it was. It was really clocks are off by a lot. And by the way, this happened to be the case in my own Stanford, the GSB. I looked around the other day on the second floor, the East building. You have no idea what time it is. Every clock says something totally different, off by hours in some cases. This is a coordination synchrony mechanism. Other people have shown that people buy and sell stocks with greater synchrony in tight cultures also. And that's something called R squared. There's also more self-control in tight cultures, again, speaking to order. Now we're talking about individual level, like people managing their impulses more, which makes a lot of sense. We're managing impulses here in a tight situation. If you live in tighter worlds, you have to manage your impulses more. That has a lot of consequences for things like societal debt, tends to be lower debt in tighter cultures. There tends to be even lower obesity, controlling for other factors in tighter cultures, and lower alcoholism. I'll just say that for research for my book, I even found that some evidence that pets might be more obese in loose cultures compared to tight cultures. My own beloved Portuguese water dog fits that bill, N of one. But the point here is that tight cultures tend to, not always, but tend to have more order, and loose cultures struggle with order. They have far less synchrony, and they have higher crime, and they have a lot of self-regulation challenges. But loose cultures really corner the market on openness in our data. They tend to be more tolerant when it comes to things like World Value Survey data in terms of who you want to be neighbors with across different races, religions, languages, immigrants, again, relatively speaking. In one study that we did, we actually wanted to look at this in the wild. We had RAs trained up in Bremen in Germany to go back to their home countries to do something very simple, to ask for help in city streets, ask for directions. And basically, we asked them to go with their normal face and ask in one condition. In another condition, they were wearing some fake facial warts that I bought them. You can buy them on the internet, just FYI. In another condition, they were wearing like purple hair and nose rings and tattoos. And we sent them back to their countries to ask for directions. And we found something pretty interesting. This is published a couple of years ago. That people, when they were just wearing the normal face, there was no difference in helping behavior around the world. But when people were wearing these kind of weird stigmas, they were helped far more in loose cultures. So this is just an example of, we could see this kind of stigma really out there in the field. And it's a really important issue when it comes to tight cultures. There's more creativity as another indication of openness. Large-scale studies of crowdsourcing that look at creativity outside of our lab have found that people are more likely to enter these contests from loose cultures and more likely to win. And finally, there's much more adaptability in terms of when new norms enter a population in loose cultures, they're more likely to take off more quickly. We've shown that with some computational models, and there's some other related data on that. So the question that is really perhaps even more important is what might cause the evolution of these differences in the first place. This is something that we really wanted to investigate in this study. As I mentioned, there was no effect of GDP, no common language, no common religion, no common geographical location that united tight cultures on the one hand and loose cultures on the other. So the question for us is what might be predicting this. And this is something we hypothesized ahead of time, where we chose nations that had variability in what we were hoping or expecting to see might help us understand the puzzle of this variation. And the big picture is that we found that really pretty simple idea, actually, that countries that had a lot of collective threat in their histories, chronic threat, whether it was from Mother Nature, think like chronic natural disasters or famine, like you see in Japan, or threat from human nature, like how many times has your nation been invaded over the last 100 years? These are the things we measured in this study. I remember some years ago, my daughter asked me if we were worried that Mexico and Canada were going to invade us. And that's the kind of stuff you write down when your kids say that. Now, there are some knuckleheads that think that out there, right? But in general, the US is a really good example of a country that has not had a lot of chronic collective threat. We've had our share of threat in this country for sure, but not chronically have we been worried about invasions. We're separated by 2 oceans from other continents. We've had our share of pathogens, but not chronically. And same with other Mother Nature disasters. So in this study, what we showed, this is kind of correlational data, so we have to take this with a grain of salt, but we did show that population density as far back as 1500, this is now thinking about Singapore in the modern era, has over 20,000 people per square mile. That's a lot of coordination that's needed. Food deprivation, territorial threat, this is the last 100 years of data from the International Crisis Archive, disasters, pathogen prevalence as far back as 100 years ago, all predicted variation in tight loose. And now that's not to say that all tight cultures have had threat and all loose cultures are on easy street. It's really a couple of very interesting exceptions. I can get into that in the Q&A, but there tends to be some connection. The other more recent data that's on this that's really interesting speaks to other predictors. This is from Thomas Telham's lab. It also speaks to a sort of the underlying issue here, which is around coordination and context where in his data you have to cultivate rice as compared to wheat. There's much more tightness that evolves in those contexts. And that's because rice is a much more difficult crop to cultivate. And if you don't do it right, you don't coordinate and people are not behaving themselves, then you can starve. So he has shown actually some nice evidence that rice cultures, both within China and across the world, tend to have tighter norms. Okay, so I want to just mention that this is not a new pattern. This is something we can look into in the pre-industrial era and start thinking about across the world. Now we're talking about really small scale societies. We can start thinking about does that same connection of threat to tightness exist in these contexts? This is where we turn to anthropologists. We started to code ethnographies with Carol Ember and Josh Jackson, and we were looking at just different domains of life. We looked at rich texts on law and ethics, socialization, gender, marriage, sexuality, funerals. These are all things that anthropologists write about. This is the human relation area files and groups in the standard sample. Got a lot of gray hair from this study. I dye it now. You know, it just takes a very long time to do this kind of work, and I'm really thankful for this group. And, you know, we were really coding how tight or loose, how constrained, how much constraint or latitude and punishment of deviance do you find across these different domains. I was really interested to see, do we see some kind of underlying factor? Like when we use factor analysis, is there kind of random variation across domains, or is it coherent and have an underlying factor? And that's what we found, that there was an underlying strong factor of tight and loose, even though some domains might actually be different. In general, groups that had tightness or looseness in these different domains had them in others. The most important thing for us, though, was to see some connection with the similar types of predictors. We also have other predictors that are more related to small-scale societies, like complexity and kinship structures and things like that, that I can get into. But in general, we could see there's some connection even prior to the modern era. Since then, we have done a lot of evolutionary game theory models on looking at the evolution of cooperation and punishment in these kinds of population level models. I won't be able to get into that, but I'm going to get into some modeling in a little bit. But that's just to say that we want to try to use different methods to see, can we replicate this conceptually with different methods? You can also prime this in the lab. You can activate threat and see how people start desiring tightness. That's an interesting method too, but it's not at the right level of analysis. So that's why we turn to evolutionary game theory. We have a recent paper with my student, Xinwei Pan, that talks about the marriage between cross-cultural psychology and evolutionary game theory that just came out in American Psychologist that kind of talks about this field. Okay, so I want to get into this kind of fractal pattern. I mentioned that we want to try to see, is there any homology across different levels of analysis? And we can turn to places like the US or China, which are very large scale countries, to see, does the same pattern kind of exist? And this is what we did in a recent PNAS study. We remapped the US 50 states, not just in terms of red and blue, but in terms of tight and loose, based on some archival indicators of constraint and latitude, as well as survey measures. And again, we can see this very similar pattern, whereby states that had a lot of disasters, think Kansas, scarcity pathogens, and have more rural types of environments where there's much more monitoring and there's more of a gossip mill, tend to have higher scores on tightness. And I'm just going to give you a couple more examples of this before I turn to some neuroscience and then get to the question of COVID and other mismatches. What we saw at the state level is a very similar order openness trade-off. For example, in tight states, we found that people were more likely to score high on personality conscientiousness. This is across millions of people. There is more law enforcement, less homelessness, and less divorce in tighter states, and more self-control in terms of lower drug use, especially recreational drug use, and also lower debt. Tight states also were more polite in our data. New York, you might imagine, it's one of the rudest states in the union, where I'm from. And you can get in a lot of trouble, you know, going from New York to South Carolina with like flipping people off, which is very common in the States. I'm also discovering a little of that in California. Loose cultures, along again, this kind of order openness trade-off, tend to have higher scores on personality openness. This is connecting with our scores that we independently measured. They have more patents per capita, more fine artists per capita, and they have more equality, less discrimination claims that we measured through the EEOC. Loose states tend to be not as polite, but they tend to be more fun. So we know that there's more recreational activities and so forth. So there's a lot of, again, you can see kind of order openness trade-off. I want to say, again, you can zoom into any tight state and find some loose elements and vice versa. So these are kind of more general themes. Some people recently, my colleague Chow has now looked at the Chinese provinces across the 31 provinces and remapped them also in terms of tight loose, looking at some similar types of predictors and consequences, and also some more interesting also ones. For example, with the exception of Tibet, they found that the further you're away from Beijing, the looser the province. So the less the eyes were upon you in terms of the government, the looser the province. Okay, I want to say a couple more things just to give you a sense of the construct, because we can also look at this over time. It's not a static construct. We analyzed shifts in tightness in the US over the last 200 years recently in a paper we published in Nature Human Behavior. We can't exactly ask people a couple hundred years ago how tight or loose was the context in the US, but we can develop, again, using different methods, ways to tap into this implicitly. And for this, we turned to computational linguistics. We developed some new dictionaries of tight loose. And that's what you see here. I won't get into the details, but you can seed out words in large corpora, look at their semantic similarity through clustering. And then we can look for convergent and divergent evidence for this construct. But you can see here that tight words include things like prevent, comply, constrain, prescribe, and loose words include things like allow, leeway, flexibility, and so forth. And what we found was really interesting. First of all, we see rising looseness and decreasing tightness over the last 200 years, with some exceptions during certain parts of our history. But we also were very interested in this order openness trade-off. Is this predicting anything over time? And we found that as looseness has been increasing in the US, so has creativity in terms of things like patents and trademarks and films. But also we see a rise in disorder in this country in terms of things like debt and truancy. And I think this itself can be seen as a very big threat to certain groups. And I'm going to come back to that when we talk about some other evolutionary mismatches. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about one more level of analysis, I promise, because I want to also illustrate how we can start thinking about this in terms of neurobiology. And of course, everything starts in the brain. So in some ways, neuroscience is just an expensive dependent variable, right? And so what we want to try to use neuroscience for is to test things that are not as easy to test with other methods. And for this, I'm going to give you an example of something that was on my mind for a long time. We sort of think about how coordination is a key aspect, a key need in tight cultures. The idea that when you have a lot of chronic threat, rules help you to coordinate. That's what norms do. They help reduce the kind of range of behavior that's permissible, and they help us coordinate. And that's really important during times of threat. And so for this, we want to see, well, is there any evidence of this? We keep talking about this, but where's the data? And so what we did was we did this study. This was published recently in SCAN with one of my students, Yan Mu, and Shihui Han and Shinobu, not Shinobu on this paper. But here we want to sort of think about, do societal threats actually increase coordination? And what role does kind of brain synchrony, another level of analysis of tightness, how does that help explain this kind of coordination behavior? Here we're interested in neural synchrony on gamma waves. Gamma waves are known to be, among other things, important in terms of detecting danger. So we wanted to see, can we see that threat actually increases coordination? Is this help facilitated by gamma synchrony? So what we're doing here is some hyper EEG work where we have people coordinating on a task, both wearing an EEG cap in different rooms, and we're looking at synchrony between the brains in this area. So this is kind of collective neuroscience. I want to give you a big picture about what we were looking at here. This was done in China, and we had 3 conditions people were randomly assigned. One was like an in-group threat. They read a newspaper article about how Japan was a very big threat over the next 5 years. Another condition was exact same article, but it was about an out-group threat. It was precise language, but it was about Ethiopia and Eritrea. And then the third condition was a control condition where it was just about China, but not about threat. And during this coordination task, they were actually trying to synchronize. The goal was to count. We gave them a certain counting task where they had to count down like from 5 to 1 and then press the computer when they were done with that task. And this goes around and around. They do multiple kind of synchrony tasks on this. And they're given feedback about how off are you with your partner in terms of the synchrony lag. And at the same time, we're measuring brain synchrony waves, as I was mentioning. So here's some data. First of all, we also had a control task with where they were doing this a computer. I just saw a sign for 10 minutes, but I didn't actually see it. So just to let you know. So here, what's really interesting here, you can see the behavioral results is just in terms of coordination. In group threat condition, we see much lower time lag. That's greater synchrony in terms of behavior on the red line here when they're actually in in-group condition compared to the control task. And we see that's even more pronounced than an out-group threat and clearly an in-group control condition. What you see on this next slide is a little confusing, but this is just how we look at electrodes and synchrony. You see here, we're looking at gamma interbrain synchrony. And what you see here is that on the left-hand side, much higher gamma synchrony in the in-group threat condition as compared to the other conditions. And what was really most important for us to see that this partially mediates the impact of societal threats on interpersonal behavioral coordination as mediated through brain synchrony. So this is just an example of how we can use neuroscience, maybe in a little bit more nuanced way to study not just an expensive dependent variable, just to try to look at questions we couldn't look at with other areas. Okay, so I want to ask you, we're going to get into now cultural evolution mismatches. If I were to ask you for show of hands, how many people, if you were to design a world, if you were in charge of designing a world, would you vote for tightness? And how many people would vote for looseness? Okay, so he's voting already. Sorry, how many people want to vote for tightness?
Or middle position?
There will be, yeah. Okay, who's going to vote for tightness? Okay, got a couple people. How many people are going to vote for looseness? And how many people are going to abstain? Okay, so this is a really interesting question that's really been dominating many fields over the centuries. As far back as Confucius and Plato, and certainly Hobbes. These people would have voted for tightness. Hobbes thought we were brutish and short and whatever he thought of us. And then you have people like John Stuart Mill and like Freud, for sure, would have voted for looseness because Freud thought rules make us neurotic. And he was pretty neurotic too, right? And so the question is, what's the answer? Like, what's correct? And we started thinking about, well, maybe groups need to veer tight or loose for good reason. But maybe the real big problems are when groups get to the extremes. So that's to the point of, you were right. And this predicts a curvilinear relationship between tight, loose, and well-being. And I want to mention that we have to mention Durkheim because he always says everything. Durkheim predicted that some societies that are very normless, he called this anemic suicide, would try to escape through suicide. And others that were very fatalistic, that had a lot of rules, would try to escape also through suicide. So he kind of had an edge on this theory, but we wanted to test this more empirically across many countries. And this is precisely what we found. This is a curvilinear relationship is controlling for the main effect, where we see that countries, with some exceptions, who are on the extremes of extreme looseness or extreme tightness, tend to have lower well-being. This is a composite measure that includes suicide, it includes well-being, it includes depression, and other things. This was published some years ago. But this really invites a very interesting question, which is, how do we think about culture change, to what Christina said, when we're getting too loose or getting too tight? And this is really what is fascinating, because we can start thinking about the fact that we might need to negotiate tight-loose. We might need to identify contexts where we need to loosen tight norms that have gotten too tight, but we might need to also be on the lookout for places where we need to tighten loose norms. And this is what I'm calling tight-loose ambidexterity. And I think it's really exciting kind of new area of how we sort of think about intentional cultural change. And just as an example, when we think about loosening up tight cultures, we call this flexible tightness. Now, these are cultures that probably need to be tight. Think about contexts like the military or airlines or hospitals. We don't want them to become super loose. That would probably not be a good idea, but they might need to insert some flexibility into that system so that they have a healthier balance. And I work with the US Navy on these precise questions. Now, on the flip side, there's contexts where we might need to tighten up loose cultures, where we need to insert some accountability into these systems, some felt accountability, some structure. I would nominate my own home now, Silicon Valley, that's in dire need of some of this. Clearly, social media is a wild, wild west of normlessness. This is a place where I'm also working in this space. How do we try to tighten norms to have a better balance of accountability and empowerment in that social system? Okay, so I need to just kind of quickly pivot. And I want to talk about another type of ambidexterity. which is how do we think about helping groups to calibrate to the level of threat that they experience? And in general, we know threat can change over time. So we might need to tighten when there's collective threat. It makes good evolutionary sense. But then we can loosen when it's safe. That seems like a pretty reasonable principle. It's harder to implement in practice, of course. But this invites a lot of different possible problems that we might see in the world. And these are what we're calling cultural evolutionary mismatches. And one is that groups might not tighten when there's an actual real threat. And we're going to see what goes on, what happened during COVID in just a second. The other, though, is actually the opposite. It's when groups are tightening when threat is not real, when it's being manipulated, when it's being, it's really been something that's just engineered. And we can see when that happens. Both of these are really problematic for different reasons. The first is problematic because it could be really detrimental to survival when we don't coordinate when there's a real threat. And the other is that we might be tightening when there's no real threat and in fact, sacrificing a lot of openness for that kind of engineered order. So I want to get into this really briefly. So I started thinking about this in March 2020 when COVID hit. And I wrote an op-ed for the Boston Globe, which was a pretty simple idea, which is, hey guys, like we need to tighten, like this, we look like a loose mess. And I thought, well, maybe we are going to tighten. Like all our evolutionary game theory models show that when threat happens, even temporary threat increases, that groups tighten. But nevertheless, we didn't see that happening. And I thought, well, there's a couple of things we never looked at. One is a lot of our evolutionary game theory models were really about objective threat, very tangible. You can't ignore it. Whereas, you know, COVID was an abstract germ. Like that's easy to ignore. It's an inconvenience to have a collective threat. So that's a problem. And the other thing we didn't think about was, well, wait a second. We never really looked to see whether loose cultures take longer to cooperate and coordinate under threat. So we started thinking about this now as an evolutionary mismatch. It might be that looseness is a liability in terms of collective threat. And again, this is an idea that the traits that are really great in one environment, looseness is great for openness, might actually be really detrimental in contexts where we need to switch quickly to a different cultural mode. This has been looked at, evolutionary mismatches, in lots of different contexts. When it comes to obesity, drug addiction, the dodo bird is a great example. This friendly bird was in Mauritius and welcoming the humans that came there, and they basically got rid of the bird because their traits were very friendly. And that was mismatched to the collective threat that was existing there. So we wanted to see, is there proof of concept of this? So as we were starting to collect some data, we developed some computational models. This is published recently in The Lancet, where we could see actually, as we're increasing threat, and I can get into the details of these models in the Q&A, basically we saw that loose groups were taking much longer to cooperate on the left, and they had lower survival rates on the right. And this is robust to lots of other different types of controls. We started then looking at cases and deaths, and this is what you'll see. This is just a pure correlation between tightness. This is now 57 countries. We expanded this data right before COVID. It was actually highly correlated with the science data. So this is pretty stable patterns of culture. Science data was collected in like early 2000s. This is 2019, and the data were correlated like 0.87. And we expanded the countries. But so there were far more cases in loose cultures, actually 5 times the cases to be exact. And this is robust to controlling for lots and lots of different things. You know, this is clearly you want to see, does it really matter? Does culture really matter compared to economics like GDP and Gini and density and testing and other cultural dimensions and previous types of government interventions and so forth. So we still see this robust effect. Then we looked at deaths per capita. You can see this here also. Strong correlation between tightness and lower deaths. There were about 9 times the deaths in loose cultures, with some exceptions. And again, we can sort of see, hey, is this really going to hold up? Is it robust? Here we also enter in mortality rate prior to COVID, like how healthy is a nation before going to COVID. So this is something that was pretty frightening, actually. And one thing I want to say, and I think our other keynote speaker might be touching on this because he found something similar, I think, within culture. But we also wanted to see what might be driving some of this. You know, when there's a collective threat, you need a strong signal that there's a threat, and you want people to actually have some sense of fear. And we were tracking fear over time. This is only about 22 nations. This is coming from YouGov in the UK. And basically, they were asking people from the first case that existed in their country up until the late fall 2020, how scared they were of COVID. And what you see here is that tight cultures had far more fear when it came to COVID. And this lasted throughout the whole first year of COVID. Even though they were doing much better, they still had a lot of fear. And loose cultures had much less fear in the early days. And then even as they were getting clobbered, still really were not taking it as seriously. And of course, there's lots of ways that signal can be interfered with, and it was much more likely to happen in contexts that have not had a lot of collective threat. Okay, so I want to just say a couple more things. We tried to develop some nudges, some nudge tournaments to see, can we get Americans to start, engaging in more sort of preventative measures, including things like wearing masks. This is with Eugen and other colleagues of ours, and nothing worked. We had like 8 different conditions. They drew on moral foundations theory from Jonathan Haidt, things like, your own personal safety, your community in-group, your patriotism. This is why we should wear masks. This is a disgusting disease. This comes from, again, purity kind of mentality. Everything that we know from moral foundations did not work in the context of threat, and including some other wise interventions that came from Walton and others, just to kind of think about this particular threat. Maybe if we wear a mask, we can reopen the economy more quickly. Maybe this is very serious, and other types of interventions, and also scientific evidence. Anyway, the big picture is that this was a pre-registered report at JESP. So we went through the review process, and then by the end, the reviewers were like, whoa, we can't wait to see like which of these is going to win. And we wanted to add them as authors. Like, they really were very helpful. And we did this with 5,000 people, representative samples, Republicans, Democrats, and Eugene's shaking his hands. We found nothing, absolutely nothing, on intentions, on attitudes, on signing a pledge. We did a follow-up tournament, which was also published, that was led up by Eugene, that was looking at how well scientists and practitioners predicted this tournament, and we could talk about that later. Anyway, the point is that we've learned a lot, is that it's really difficult to think about how to avoid these mismatches, because these cultural codes run deep. We're still a little bit at a loss of how might we prepare in the next pandemic, but I do think there's a couple of lessons. One is that we need clear and consistent messaging to make the threat concrete. We need to remind people this is temporary tightening, that the faster we tighten, the faster we'll actually reduce the threat. And that's actually what we found in our computational models. And the faster we can have our freedom. Other things we've learned is that it might be more important to target personal values in looser cultures. They predict behavior much more. There's a paper we have under review at an economic journal now with Jim, where we manipulated tight and loose norms in the lab in terms of variance that people see in strategic game environments. And actually, personal values predict much more in looser context, and norms predict more in tighter context. So that's maybe something we can talk about with some of the interventions, Christina, you've been doing. I'm going to take just 2 more minutes, I promise, and then we'll open it up. I did start late. I want to negotiate for that. I studied negotiation, so I always invoke that. But I want to get to the other mismatch really quickly to tell you what we've been doing on this, because I think it's also equally problematic, is context where we're actually tightening when there's not an objective threat. And we've seen evidence of this in the lab. So we can activate threat very quickly, even though it's fake threat, whether it's disasters or pathogens and so forth. We just manipulate this in temporary type of lab experiments where people start tightening and they want more rules. They start getting more ethnocentric in terms of that order openness trade-off. And they also like really strong leaders in these kind of contexts. We also saw this in the 2016 election. People who perceived a lot of threat, even when it wasn't necessarily real, were wanting more tightness. And this in turn was related to them liking Trump more, controlling for lots of other things. That's not to say that there's not threat in this country. In fact, people really do have a lot of objective threat coming from working class in terms of manufacturing, jobs being replaced by AI and so forth. But this is in general, we can see that people are very responsive to signals that there's threat. Of course, we know that autocrats hijack this psychology. They're very good cross-cultural psychologists. They talk about a lot of threat, and they target groups that are really threatened. And then they promise that they can fix this threat and return that group to a tight social order. It's not like a new phenomenon. It's not, it's not some charismatic leader, in this country or others. This is just a very classic pattern. So what we want to do most recently, and I promise in the last couple of slides, is start being able to diagnose when people are doing this. Like, why not try to really detect and have like a threat meter. Like when you're looking through Facebook or through Twitter, like how about, let's figure out like how much are you being targeted with threat talk? This is happening all the time. We know it affects our neurobiology and blah, 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 but we don't have a lot of control over when it's happening. So we developed a new dictionary, just came out in PNAS, where we developed a new dictionary to detect threat and to look at how it's affecting behavior at the collective level in the US over the last 100 years. We wanted to develop a dictionary that had some construct validity across different contexts, including Wikipedia, Twitter, and Common Crawl. So we trained these models with large corpora where we're seeding them out and then looking through spectral clustering, the kind of how they cohere in terms of actual, almost like a factor analysis, how they kind of cluster together. You could see this dictionary, just some example of these words. These are very much not about specific threats. They're really about general threat mentality, things like attack, disaster, lethal, looming, meltdown, et cetera. And this is just a way to visualize this in this very large multidimensional space. We then started to look for validity for this data, for this threat dictionary. We studied newspapers over time, and we also looked at Twitter. And we, first of all, wanted to see during times of actual threat, do we see increases in the threat dictionary during 9/11, during World War II, during Korea? And we first looked at this construct validity. And then we started to see like, okay, what does this predict over time using ARIMA models? Also, as another construct validity, we want to see like, is there a difference across parties in terms of the threat talk? So we got all the congressional and all the presidential speeches that were done during these times of different leaders. And you could see there was a pretty strong effect with some exceptions of Republicans and Democrats using threat talk. And also, importantly, we can see lots of different ways in which this dictionary can predict things. And I'm going to stop in one more slide, I promise. We saw, this is over 100 years, we use our tight loose dictionary. We also used other dictionaries that were on collectivism and showed that during times of threat, that actually tightness was increasing and so was collectivism. I'll just have a call out to Steven Pinker. We did see gradual decreases in threat talk over the last 100 years in the US, although there seems to be some evidence in this data that there could be increases in threat that's happening in newspapers and other types of corpora. Also, we could see, as we're gathering data from other sources, we could see also political shifts during times of threat. There's more anti-immigration attitudes. There's higher presidential ratings. This is rally around the flag effect. And there's more identification with the Republican Party. And also economically, we could see shifts in the stock market. So this is back using S&P 500 and Dow Jones and NASDAQ. We could see that during times of high threat, there's lower stock activity and also lower patents. So I can get into detail. The last thing I'll say is that threat in our data was very contagious. So we looked in Twitter to see the more tweets included threat talk. This is controlling for Jay's Van Bavel's dictionary on moral emotions and other types of things, how many followers you have. We could see that the more your tweets even include one threat word, it's going to really be a lubricant for it's really kind of being more contagious. So that's really about it. I just want to say thank you. And also, I'm really looking forward to conversations and potential collaborations. And I'll open it up for questions.
It was cute to see Michelle like rush through this because she thought maybe because I'm German we will have like tight enforcement of the rules. Let me also just say you might wonder what has she not done, and so this was probably just the first page of her CV of publications. And so let me stress that she was part of a paper very highly cited at the beginning of 2020, March 2020, with all kinds of superstars talking about what can social science do to inform pandemic behavior. And so just yesterday, a paper dropped where we, with a bunch of other people like Kai Ruggieri, we're looking back at that paper, looking at what they suggested. Did this actually work? Did this actually bear out in the empirical data? And we find a lot of good evidence that what they suggested this team actually worked out very well in the pandemic. All right. So let me just open up for some questions, and then maybe you can state your name and then we'll go ahead. But Jen, go ahead.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, can I ask?
Yeah.
So there's a clarity of when to apply certain norms in situations where they sort of fit. I'm curious whether you have which things trying to get tighter.
Yeah. Yeah, this is such a great question. And I think one of the things we've been doing more and more is getting more and more micro in terms of like domains. And so, for example, I didn't get into the organizational level here, but we're doing a lot of work on how do you kind of think about the workplace in terms of the different domains in which you'll find norms. So we can give organizations a profile of like how much constraint or latitude are there in different domains. So for example, how clear and reliable and in terms of punishments, how much are punishments activated during domains like the way you speak at work, the clothes you wear, where and when and how you work, social interaction norms and all this. So we have like a new measure that's domain specific around this that we can then sort of think about, okay, as a leader, what domains can you selectively loosen or tighten? And we also think about this in terms of like, if you're trying to loosen a tight organization, you could think about, okay, you need to give people more exploration time. You need to challenge whether all the rules that we have are really necessary. A lot of rules tend to be like silly norms. We're doing a lot of work on the evolution of silly norms. Silly norms are like things that don't even have any function. So in the Navy, that might be things like, do we really need to like worry about the haircuts and the length of the hair or the socks we wear? Now, some people might argue like, yes, in fact, if people are following those rules, then they're going to follow the rules on the battlefield, which are much more serious. So we sort of thinking about, no, we need to actually, that speaks to one aspect of tight rules, like how many rules we have. Like maybe we need to kind of really think about which rules are absolutely necessary. And then we can also think about releasing people from accountability, from potential conformist pressure, like giving them spaces, like really like either temporal or physical places where they can explore. So there's lots of ways I think that this needs to happen for it to be sticky, for it to actually work. And of course, the same could be said on the flip side. Like we need to think about where do we need to have more accountability? And these shifts are really difficult. If you're trying to shift a tight system to be more loose, what I found in interviewing people, including in manufacturing companies and so forth, is that it's a really serious concern about the lack of order and lack of control. Because these are contexts that have a lot of coordination needs. And so you can't just like suddenly say, hey guys, we're going to loosen. Like there's a lot of resistance. On the flip side, when you're trying to tighten a loose system, I've seen a similar problem where it's not about control, but it's about autonomy. And people are like, wait, why are we trying to standardize everything now? We got into this startup or into these contexts where we want to be loose and freewheeling. But the problem is that those cultural codes often are not adaptable to large scale coordination when those firms scale up. So anyway, big picture is that let's talk, because I think the more granular we get in terms of domains, and then the more we think about the pressures and the kinds of things we need to do to negotiate this, the better.
Thank you. Can we do one on Zoom and then we'll go to the rest? Sorry. Yes. Dan?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, thanks. Wow, what an interesting talk. And, lots of different ideas come up. But one thing I'm thinking is that you started with countries and then you moved into within countries. And it seems to me that a lot of the rules that work for countries don't work within countries. So Republicans are much tighter and they're much more oppositional and dysfunctional when it comes to dealing with a pandemic like we just had.
Yeah.
And to them, the threat, the way they dealt with the threat was to say, oh, it's not a threat. Yeah. So I think there's a lot more going on here than just how threatened are you.
Yeah. By the way, this is a fantastic question. And I don't know if any of you saw Ezra Klein's article in The Atlantic about this. And Dan, you're exactly on point. I mean, there's been decades of research that have shown that conservatives are more threat sensitive, even when it comes to like neuroscience. And then we have a pandemic and everything is topsy-turvy. It turned on its head. And the question is why? And I will say, I will put some money, the college education funds of my kids, on this, which is that when you have a collective threat, you're looking at your leaders to sort of figure out, especially when it's a pandemic, when it's abstract germ, where you're not really sure what's going on. And you're looking at your leaders to help you, especially in loose cultures, to figure out what's going on. And here's where we have a big problem, that Republicans and people from tight groups like strong leaders, and they look to them very, very closely. And when your leader is telling you, don't worry about this, guys and girls, that releases you from the pressure to have to tighten. So that doesn't mean that it wouldn't have happened if there were a Democratic president during the time, because this is an issue of an abstract germ. And I don't think we would have seen this if we were looking at terrorism or warfare. So this really helps us to refine the theory on what's happening with conservatives. What kind of threat are we talking about? I think we were dealing with something we haven't really thought about. And I'll mention that at the international level, we're looking at chronic threat over time. And these things tend to be correlated. If you factor analyze threats at the national level, countries that have had a lot of warfare have also had a lot of pandemics. They've also had a lot of other threats. And so these things at the national level have tended to be really, really tightly connected. Now we're trying to think about these more separately, and we're trying to think about how do we deal with threats that have different levels of onset, fast or slow, different levels of abstraction, warfare or pandemics, different levels of severity. And to that, I'll say, wait and invite you back in a couple of years, because we have a new Minerva grant with the DoD, with Carol Ember and some other colleagues, where we're actually looking, again, in ancient societies, we're really now being much more fine-grained about how we're measuring threats in the standard sample. We'll come back and talk about resilience and what we know about it. So stay tuned. Yeah.
Yes, Keith Newman, thank you for a great talk. I'm wondering if you can comment on the relationship between the tight-loose dimension and the concept of social capital, which on the surface you might think that tight shelters might have more social capital. And I think in Robert Putnam's recent work and sort of the IWE. So those things probably interact in an interesting way. Could you comment?
Yeah, this is such a great question. And we're doing quite a bit of work now on the issue of tight, loose, and trust, and how it, and even cooperation, and how it might be really kind of a very nuanced relationship. And I started thinking about this because I started asking people in libraries versus in the union, this was at U Maryland, the attributions they were making about other people's behavior. And in the library, people would say, oh, people are behaving the way they are because of the situation, because they have to. And in the lounge and in the student union, they're like, no, people are behaving the way they're behaving because they internally want to do this. And that's a distinction in psychology. We talk about external versus internal attributions. We started thinking about this when it came to tight loose. And the idea is that, and this is actually stems from Yamagishi's work, who passed away a couple of years ago in Japan. And he argued that actually Japanese society is not a high social capital society in the way that Americans think about it. In fact, he argued that if there's not strong rules in a situation, people will defect. And that actually the basis of trust in what I would say a tight culture is really around mutual monitoring. It's around mutual assurance that people are going to behave themselves. In fact, in those contexts, you don't need to worry about, is this person benevolent? Are they high on integrity? Are they competent? Those individualistic psychological basis of trust are really not relevant in tight cultures where the basis of trust is more structural. It's about the norms and the rules. This is also the case. I do a lot of work in the Middle East. There's a lot of wasta in Guangxi in China where like you trust people who know each other that you know, because that will keep them accountable. And so I think that unless you have that mutual monitoring and the capacity for that, you're not going to see a lot of cooperation and trust in a tight culture. And we've been starting to meta-analyze a lot of these big databases that look at trust across cultures. But the problem is they're all about individualistic measures of trust. There's no good measure of mutual assurance trust out there that Yamagishi would have wanted to see. And so this is another way in which our individualistic Western kind of ideas kind of enter the academic market. The World Value Survey measures, and God bless the World Value Survey, but they're not useful because they don't talk about what is the nature of that trust. Is it structural? Is it psychological? Because we're going to get very different answers. We're going to get very different answers to the question of who's going to cooperate with anonymous strangers in a game where there's no mutual monitoring. We shouldn't find that tightness is connected to that at all, because there's no sense of mutual assurance in that context. And Yamagishi would have said, no way are people going to cooperate. So these conclusions we draw about national differences, I sound like a religious fanatic right now, but there's really big problems with the measures that we use and the conclusions we come to. So stay tuned on that. And I'll report back after we've done some more work on it.
Yes, we can do 5 more minutes of questions and then we'll have the break.
Marcus Brower. Thank you, Michelle. Always a delight to listen to you. Can you elaborate on how tightness and looseness is related to the construct of historical heterogeneity? So you probably know this, but historical heterogeneity takes into account the overlap between the country's current population and its population 500 years ago. It also takes into account the number of source countries that the immigrants are from.
Yeah.
And the question I had, isn't it just historical heterogeneity? Isn't it just that sort of immigrant countries have lower pathogen threat and people go there because there are fewer disasters, there are fewer threats, there's more space, there's less population density. And in a certain way, they go there. People go there because there's less threat. And then because they're immigrant countries, the cultures are more loose. The norms are more loose. So
this
could
is.
you elaborate on that relationship?
Of course. I think it's a really interesting idea. I think that the connection between heterogeneity and tightness is complicated. In fact, it's curvilinear. I think everything's curvilinear, by the way. We just can never really get the data for it. But I think that's a reasonable idea that might be part of, like, there might be some selection effect, that these places are more tolerant, the looser norms, and welcoming in immigrants could actually enhance that looseness. So there's some connection between that. But what we know from our data, and this is coming from Alessinia's data on linguistic fractionalization, on ethnic fractionalization, other measures of diversity, that actually loose cultures have that up to a point, but actually as that gets to be pretty high, we see actually higher tightness. So for example, Pakistan's a good example. It's extraordinarily diverse and it's pretty tight in our data. There's some domains of looseness like driving behavior, but there's not a lot of mutual assurance and so forth. So we find a pretty robust curvilinear relationship between diversity and tightness. And this is why I get a little nervous when people want to use measures of value congruence in a country as an indication of tightness. I'm all for multiple measures, but that's to me kind of problematic because in fact, personal values can be very different in attitudes in tight cultures. That people might have all sorts of beliefs about the world, but they know that they have to actually follow the norms. And that's where it's really important to be very attentive to the context. So I guess my big picture would be, I think this partly, I would put some money on your hypothesis, but I also think it's not the only driver because we know there's lots of exceptions to the heterogeneity. There's also, we see a lot of countries where immigration is causing increases in tightness because it's seen as a threat. There's also all sorts of misperceptions about that, particularly in the US. Again, we have this kind of mismatch of what's really happening with immigration. We published an LA Times article about just how bad this mismatch is among certain populations and how they perceive immigration, which can then tighten groups. And this happens, of course, in other contexts in Europe as well. But yeah, I definitely want to connect with stuff you're doing. One of the things I want to mention too, we're very interested in the concept of pluralistic ignorance that relates to kind of, because I think you have a paper on this, and that's the same exact idea, is that in tight cultures, you don't really know what people's values or attitudes are. People are not wearing them on their sleeves. Personal values that we showed in our paper and others are actually more predictive of behavior in loose cultures. So you kind of know more what people are thinking. And that opens up all sorts of problems with pluralistic ignorance in tighter cultures. And I'd like to see who else is interested in that topic, because we'd really like to start exploring that, of how do you help people understand. It came from Yamagishi's work. I'm going to say one more thing, sorry about this. Yamagishi was just a brilliant person. Asked people in Japan that he had two conditions. One was like person A and person B. Person A was like loose and individualistic. Person B was tight and collectivistic. And he asked them, who do you like more? And the vast majority of people loved the individualistic person who was loose, but they thought everyone else in Japan liked the person who was tight and collectivistic. And he called this, basically niche construction, and it's pluralistic ignorance. So that's just, that was the one data point that I could see there's some evidence for this problem that comes from that value behavior connection.
Right. Yes. Just very quickly, the last one, and then, yeah, sorry.
A quick question. So first of all, I'm a macroeconomist, so I liked some macro variables that you put up on the slides. I have a quick question. So particularly, there's a data set which is compiled at Stanford by Nick Bloom from the economics department. It's about uncertainty. Yeah. Right. So policy uncertainty, and this index spiked, during COVID. spiked during the financial crisis. And it's kind of an indicator that we live in a very uncertain world, lots of uncertainty out there. I was kind of wondering whether there's any connection, you've thought about this, or any connection between uncertainty, which is pretty much perceived by people, and whether this brings kind of like tightness or people get more loose, societies change, and they see the world change. So we live in a very uncertain world now.
Yeah,
so.
This is such a great question. And I think it's, again, like a really complicated space. Because on one hand, uncertainty varies based on the threat. So that's why we're trying to kind of decouple like the types of threats. So we want to see which of these really produce the most tightness. But I do think that tremendous uncertainty can really cause very different dynamics in terms of pendulum shifts towards tightness. So kind of like an attractor in dynamical systems theory. And some of the evidence of that comes from Egypt, from Arab Spring. We have some data and also some modeling on this, where, in Egypt, when you took out that tight, autocratic leader in Egypt, this created so much uncertainty in the system. And of course, autocrats are in the business of getting people to distrust each other. That's their job, because if they trusted each other, they throw out the autocrat. So when you take out someone that's extraordinarily creating a lot of order and predictability in that system, the system can go to the exact opposite. It can go to total uncertainty and anomie. And that's what we found when we were on the ground in Egypt after Mubarak was taken out. People were not just screaming freedom. They were like, this is chaos. Like, we don't know, we can't coordinate, we can't trust people. And the more people perceived that uncertainty, the more they wanted the Salafi government, they wanted the Muslim government. And, Americans, like, especially policy people, this happens all the time. They don't realize that, there's aspects of the system that are going to actually, we call this autocratic recidivism, and it's based on uncertainty. And I think that a lot of the uncertainty that we're seeing now is affecting desired tightness. And some of that's actual uncertainty, some of it's made up, and so forth. So that's where we get to this question of how do we better calibrate?
I am so sorry. I know there are more questions, but we have to end this session here. Thank you so much.
Thank you.